Allow me to make one point. If the United States cannot get rare earth products from China to the United States, the U.S. national defense industry need to grind to a halt.
American farmers have long struggled with high costs and low prices for their crops. But this year, amid trade wars and tariffs, there is even greater uncertainty in the fields.
I hear it's affecting your health.
Yes. 4 blood pressure pills a day, 3 different medicines. 2 years ago, none.
What do you think about when you go to bed at night?
What's going to be left in a year? Am I the one that broke what started in the late 1800s?
We are back now with the latest on the brewing trade war between the U.S. and China. Farmers here in central North Carolina tell Eyewitness News China has now stopped buying one of their key crops in light of that ongoing dispute.
And it's a crop that has an economic impact of more than $1 billion. John Dowding spoke with farmers who say the stoppage is impacting multiple crops here in North Carolina.
We import from China massive amounts, and maybe we'll have to stop doing that.
The message is we need our government to do their job.
The farmers are going to be making a fortune.
There's a lot of pain going on the countryside right now.
The first signs of panic did not come from headlines, but from silence. Commodity terminals in the United States reported delayed orders. Shipping schedules thinned. Traders waited for confirmations that never arrived. Then the notices circulated quietly through markets. Soybean contracts were being redirected, and rare earth shipments were being suspended under new frameworks agreed between Africa and China. What had once been routine trade flows suddenly became uncertain. For decades, the United States had relied on its agricultural dominance and technological leverage to anchor global supply chains. Soybeans fed factories, livestock systems, and food processors across Asia. Rare earths underpinned electronics, defense systems, renewable energy, and advanced manufacturing. These exports were not just products. They were pillars of economic influence. Africa and China recalculated together. Food security and resource sovereignty had become inseparable from national strategy. Supply chains that depended on a single external source now looked dangerously exposed. Africa, long treated as a raw material supplier, had reached a turning point. It no longer sought to export without control. China, seeking insulation from geopolitical shocks, supported that shift. The cutoff did not arrive as a blunt ban. It came through revised export conditions, new processing requirements, domestic value retention policies, and long-term supply reservations. Soybeans grown in Africa were prioritized for regional food systems and China-bound agreements. Rare earths extracted across African countries were rerouted into joint processing ventures rather. Then exported raw, the United States felt the impact immediately. American agribusinesses scrambled to find alternative buyers as demand softened, prices wavered, storage costs climbed, farmers faced uncertainty just as planting decisions loomed. In technology sectors, executives confronted a deeper problem. Rare earth access had never been guaranteed, but it had been assumed. Now assumption was no longer enough. Africa's role in this shift stunned observers. For years, African countries had been pressured to export raw commodities cheaply. Processing had been discouraged through trade barriers, financing constraints, and infrastructure gaps. That model was now deliberately dismantled. New policies required minerals to be refined locally. Agricultural exports faced quotas aligned with domestic. And strategic needs, China supported the transformation. Joint facilities appeared near mining regions. Agricultural corridors expanded with Chinese-backed logistics. Payment systems adapted to bypass traditional intermediaries. The result was not disruption for its own sake, but insulation. America interpreted insulation as exclusion. Policy briefings warned of supply chain vulnerability. Media narratives framed the move as hostile coordination. Yet Africa and China emphasized continuity, not confrontation. Trade continued, but on different terms. Those terms mattered. Rare earths were no longer shipped as unprocessed ore. Soybeans were no longer guaranteed for export regardless of domestic demand. Control shifted upstream, closer to production. Value stayed local longer. The panic in Washington intensified because options were limited. Developing alternative rare earth supply chains required years of investment and regulatory reform. Expanding soybean exports to new markets meant competing on price without guaranteed demand. Strategic reserves could soften the shock but not reverse it. Markets reacted faster than policymakers. Technology firms revised production forecasts, defense contractors reassessed sourcing strategies, agricultural cooperatives lobbied for emergency support. The interconnectedness of food and technology became impossible to ignore. Africa's internal dynamics shifted as well. Farmers saw stronger bargaining power, mining regions experienced renewed investment, processing facilities created skilled jobs, governments gained leverage not only economically but diplomatically. This was not accidental. The alignment with China was structured to avoid dependency. Africa retained ownership stakes, technology transfer. Clauses were enforced, export volumes were calibrated. The objective was resilience, not replacement. China's calculus was pragmatic. Diversifying supply reduced exposure to external pressure. Supporting African processing stabilized long-term access. The partnership was transactional but mutually reinforcing. The United States faced a narrative shock. For decades, global trade had been framed around American centrality. The sudden realization that critical supplies could be restructured without American participation unsettled markets and policymakers alike. Soybeans symbolized the vulnerability. Once a tool of influence, they became a point of exposure. Rare earths amplified the fear. Without them, entire industries stalled. The panic did not mean collapse. The United States remained a major producer, innovator, and market, but it confronted a new reality. Leverage had limits when alternatives matured. Africa's decision reverberated globally. Other resource-rich regions took note. Processing over extraction gained momentum. Commodity nationalism evolved into commodity strategy. The world adjusted. Trade did not stop. It reoriented. By the end of the first phase, one truth was unavoidable. America was no longer the default supplier for food and technology inputs. Africa and China had demonstrated that coordination, patience, and strategic control could redraw supply chains once thought permanent. And that realization, more than any immediate shortage, was what triggered the panic. After the initial shock had already settled into market behavior, when panic gave way to recalculation, what mattered now was not the announcement of restricted soybeans and rare earths, but the permanence of the new structure taking shape beneath global trade. The world began to understand that this was not a temporary disruption, but a redesign. America's response shifted from alarm to damage control. Emergency consultations filled policy calendars, agricultural agencies assessed surplus risks, technology regulators examined strategic stockpiles, defense planners quietly elevated supply chain security to the same level as military readiness. Yet even as responses multiplied, they ran into a common constraint: time. Building alternatives would take years, not quarters. Africa and China used that time deliberately. Rather than accelerating exports to exploit American vulnerability, they slowed and stabilized. This restraint signaled confidence. Soybean flows were calibrated to meet domestic needs first, then contractual obligations to China. Rare earth output prioritized processing capacity over volume, ensuring that refining and component manufacturing expanded alongside extraction. The shift altered global pricing mechanisms. Soybean markets decoupled from U.S.-centric benchmarks. Regional pricing structures emerged in Africa and Asia, reflecting new logistics routes and demand centers. Rare earth pricing became opaque by design, tied to processing contracts rather than spot markets. This reduced speculation and increased predictability for partners, while frustrating outsiders. American producers felt the consequences unevenly. Large agribusiness firms absorbed losses through diversification, but smaller farming communities bore the brunt. Storage facilities filled, credit tightened, insurance claims rose. In mining and technology, firms reliant on just-in-time sourcing confronted production delays that rippled across supply chains. Africa experienced a contrasting dynamic. Control over resources translated into leverage. Governments coordinated across borders to prevent undercutting. Export councils enforced standards. Revenue that once leaked through raw exports now funded infrastructure, education, and energy projects. The internal conversation shifted from scarcity to stewardship. China integrated the new supply model into long-term planning. Food security strategies incorporated African production cycles. Industrial policy aligned rare earth access with domestic manufacturing goals. Joint research initiatives focused on improving yields, processing efficiency, and recycling. Dependence gave way to interdependence. The United States confronted a strategic paradox. It possessed vast resources, advanced technology, and capital, yet it had optimized for efficiency over resilience. The sudden loss of assumed access exposed the fragility of that optimization. Rebuilding resilience required trade-offs that were politically and economically difficult. Diplomatic pressure offered limited relief. Africa's policies complied with international norms. There were no outright bans, only conditions. China framed its role as supportive, not directive. Legal challenges stalled, rhetoric escalated. But leverage did not. Markets adapted faster than politics. Technology firms redesigned products to reduce rare earth intensity. Recycling initiatives accelerated. Alternative materials research gained funding. In agriculture, exporters sought new buyers, often at lower margins. The adjustment was painful but unavoidable. Africa's confidence deepened. The success of coordinated control validated. Years of policy debate. Resource nationalism, once dismissed as risky, evolved into resource strategy grounded in data and cooperation. The continent demonstrated that it could act collectively without sacrificing internal diversity. This collective posture changed negotiations beyond soybeans and rare earths. Energy contracts, mineral rights, and agricultural concessions were revisited. New agreements emphasized local processing, shared ownership, and long-term capacity building. Investors adapted, recognizing that access now required alignment with development goals. China's role remained pragmatic. It did not seek exclusivity. It sought reliability. By supporting Africa's value retention, it secured stable partnerships, insulated from external shocks. This approach contrasted sharply with earlier eras of extractive urgency. America's panic transformed into introspection. Policy reviews questioned decades-old assumptions. Should supply chains be reshored at higher cost? Should alliances be restructured around resilience rather than price? Should domestic processing be subsidized aggressively? These questions had no easy answers. The global system absorbed the shock. Trade volumes recovered under new configurations. Consumers adjusted, industries recalibrated. What did not return was the old hierarchy of control. Africa's position was no longer peripheral. By managing soybeans and rare earths together, Africa demonstrated that food and technology were two sides of the same strategic coin. Control over one reinforced leverage over the other. This lesson resonated globally. Other regions explored similar coordination. Resource-rich countries reconsidered export-first models. Processing and manufacturing moved closer to source. The era of unquestioned raw material flow began to close. The United States remained a central player, but no longer singular. Its panic stemmed from recognition, not ruin. The realization that influence could be diluted through cooperation elsewhere marked a psychological turning point. Africa and China did not declare victory. They institutionalized the new normal. Committees replaced announcements. Standards replaced slogans. The work became technical, quiet, and durable. By the end of the second phase, the world had adjusted to a reality where soybeans and rare earths were no longer automatic instruments of American power. They were strategic resources governed by those who produced and processed them. The panic faded, but the structure remained, and in that structure, Africa had moved from supplier to steward, China from buyer to partner, and America from assumption to adaptation.